think we're all right, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to the March 3rd special meeting of the Planning Advisory Commission. If we can, let's start with roll call.
Will Harris.
Here.
Jeff Carey.
Here.
Bill Baldwin.
Here.
Mike Hope.
Here.
Bob Wilkerson.
Here.
Randy Lewis.
Here.
And Brad Carlin.
Here.
Excellent. That worked. All right. We have a quorum. We have all 7 members present. And so if everyone could take a look at the agenda, so approval or any changes. Does anyone recommend any changes to the agenda? And if I may, I will recommend that the presentations be 30 minutes for the presentations and then 30 minutes to go around the table. I think 30 minutes was the direction or the request you made of the briefers. Okay, good. So that aligns, but that gives us, and literally we'll just start, go around the table with questions, go back around again, if that is acceptable to the board. And then I'd like to suggest that after both briefings, we wrap up with a 30-minute period where we simply make our observations. Am I?
This is one.
He's testing.
Muted.
He's testing.
Okay, there's background noise somewhere up here.
That's not me. I'm unmuted.
Well,
but you're
try
speaker-
there.
Actually, it is.
Yeah, so if you could turn the volume down, that'd be great. Thank you.
Hard
I
to
just had an extra voice up here and apparently it's me.
Oh, you're right. It's coming out.
Okay.
I'm gonna leave the meeting.
Yeah, so whatever.
I'm done
So
with my test.
what I'd like to do, what I would suggest is we take 15 minutes to discuss housing. And literally just start with one person and say, what's your summary? What are your observations tonight? While we still don't forget things and we sort of go around for the 6 of us, the 7 of us. And then we do the same thing with the second session too. As we talk about this, what's your couple of minutes, what's your observations of maybe challenges going forward? So those are the 2 amendments I would like to make. Is this 30 minutes for the brief, 30 minutes for questions, and then a summary session at the end to 30 minutes.
Make a motion to approve the agenda with those 3 additions.
All in favor?
Aye.
Thank you. Does anyone have a conflict of interest tonight? Next meeting is on March 17th, is down at Public Works. So for everyone in the room to move to Public Works, with that the request of the citizens to have a meeting that's a little larger so we accommodate more people. And very importantly, we're going to try and set it up to where people can see all our faces, not just a few of us. So we're trying to work that. Staff has done a great job in pulling that forward. All right, staff committee updates.
On Thursday, we got for the Allen UPA. That was at the Port of Allen meeting room. And I just want to let the public know that the boards that we had they're online. So you can take a look at them. They're I'll just say they're there and you can look, but they are online for viewing. Some background information on development regulations and other boards with maps. Then on the front page of project page, right here, it says Allen Urban Growth Area Community Survey. We had a paper survey there and another option for people to fill out the survey online. So that's on that main page of our project page. And then just for the commissioners and the public, if you want to look at the current housing element between this time and when we get the new or the revisions, it's on the website and it's under current adopted plan. So if you're on that main page for the 2025 comprehensive plan update. there'll be a line that says current adopted plan, and you can go in there and find all the current adopted chapters. So suggest looking at that just to get a heads up on the type of information that's in the plan already, before we get a revised draft. And then I will turn it back over to the chair.
Okay, any committee members with any updates?
Nope.
Just on the Allen UGA meeting, myself, Randy Lewis, Deb Carey attended. We also had two representatives of our Transportation Citizen Action Board there. The county was represented by Commissioner Netherland, Mr. Mark Neary, our county administrator, and our auditor was also there at the meeting. So with that, great, we're going to go straight on into our housing element. So with that, Miss Laura Hodgson, am I saying that correct? Okay, good. Your head's going up and down. That's good. First, Laura, welcome very much. On behalf of the entire Planning Advisory Commission of Mason County, thank you very much for coming in. And the purpose of this is for us to understand what the requirements are for the housing element. There are a number of changes, and as we're probably both aware, there's a number of changes going through the legislation right now that may become applicable, 5 months, 6 months down the road. So let's talk about what we know. Over to you.
Great, thank you. Can you see my screen? Sorry, can you hear me and see my screen? Verbal, great, thank you. Oh, well, thank you for having me here today. I appreciate your time to consider these updates, especially since this is on your evening time when hopefully you should be relaxing. So hopefully we'll keep this as short as possible, but thank you so much for having me today. My name is Laura Hodgson. I'm the Housing Planning and Data Manager at the Department of Commerce, and in my role, I help local communities as they plan for their housing needs with their comprehensive plan updates and as they pair that with development regulations that and then implement those comprehensive plan updates. So thank you for letting me attend tonight. Before I begin, just a quick word about Commerce. At Commerce, we strengthen communities through just about every aspect of community and economic development. A lot of Commerce is funding, as you'll see on the screen, whether that is through housing, through our housing trust fund, or infrastructure and broadband, or economic development, but we also support communities as they plan for their future growth under the Growth Management Act and plan for their specific needs as they grow within their communities. As we know, every community in Washington is growing. So today I'd like to share a little bit about what has changed since the last time you've completed a comprehensive plan periodic update. In 2021, the legislature made some significant changes to the way communities are required to plan, intending to help communities to plan for all individuals in their community and do so in a more robust way, because we were seeing that housing was not aligning with what every community needed in their community. So they directed the Department of Commerce to project future housing needs by income level for every community in Washington. They said you need to divide up what those future housing needs are by income level. So moderate, low, very low, extremely low income housing, as well as for the first time project permanent supportive housing and emergency shelter needs. Just for a little bit of context, permanent supportive housing is normally permanent housing for individuals who need a little extra supportive services in their lives. And emergency housing and emergency shelter is short-term housing for those in between housing options or who may need housing maybe for a little bit longer until affordable housing actually becomes available, because we know in many communities affordable housing is not very common, or we don't have as much of it as many of our communities need. So the department developed those projected housing needs, and I'll talk a little bit more about that in a future slide. And then the legislature also said communities throughout Washington that fully plan, your local planning efforts have been really great. However, we're not seeing housing align with our community needs. Therefore, we're going to direct you to take a little bit more steps to make sure that you're planning for this housing, not building, but planning for this housing in your communities. So in your comprehensive plans, you now need to identify local housing needs, but those need to be based on the Commerce's countywide projections of housing need numbers. When you identify your land capacity, you will now need to identify land capacity for housing needs of all income levels. When you make adequate provisions, again, that requirement was already in there. You now need to document what are those barriers that are preventing the housing from being built in your community, and what can you do within the local government span of control to encourage more affordable housing in your community, and develop a list of actions to do that. And then identify and begin to undo racially disparate impacts, exclusion, and displacement. We recognize that in the past, not only local governments, but state and federal governments have policies and regulations, and not only in the land use sphere, but also many cases in the financing sphere, have led to some community members being not able to access housing as equitably, and in some cases not at all, because of their race and or ethnic background. So recognizing that local governments can maybe undo some of that with their policies and the control that they have in land use planning, the legislature is directing them to begin to undo that to the extent that they can, recognizing that housing is important for everybody to have in our communities. So under this new framework, the legislature directed communities to take a more active role in planning for housing. And I'll walk through what each of these pieces means in a more detailed fashion. But generally speaking, the goal of the GMA also changed. It changed from encourage affordable housing to plan for and accommodate housing. And generally that means doing each of the things that I previously outlined on this screen, but it means, in a nutshell, having sufficient land capacity for your jurisdiction's housing needs across all incomes, allowing the types of housing in your community that will meet those types of housing needs, recognizing that some types of housing are more affordable than other types of housing, so we need to have a broad range of housing types and sizes to accommodate a variety of different individuals' lifestyles and economic situations, identifying, planning for those barriers, and then planning for sufficient governmental services to support that housing. So with housing comes planning, and that housing growth comes planning for transportation, sidewalks, streets, transit, when applicable, capital facilities, and utilities. It does not mean that jurisdictions need to build the housing, but they do need to lay the framework to allow that housing to come and for the services to come to support it. So I'd like you to keep that in mind as we give this presentation, because while we talk about housing needs, the housing needs will look aspirational, and then in some ways they are, but we also recognize that local governments have a lot of control to affect what types of housing come on the ground. So that's what the goal of the housing element is to do, is to broaden what opportunities are available to residents. So over the next 20 years, the Department of Commerce projects that the Washington state as a whole will need 1.1 million new homes. And broken down by income level, you see here on the screen that we need a wide variety of types of housing. In many communities in the past, we've allowed a small area of housing to have higher density, such as apartments, and a large portion of our jurisdictions to allow single-family homes. And that hasn't always been enough to meet our housing needs, or won't be in moving forward. And in order to make sure that every person has a home, including those who are projected to be homeless or housing unstable in the future, and in order for renters to not be cost burdened, so that they don't fall into homelessness, and so that they can afford retirement and their medical expenses and things like that, we need to have housing that people are paying no more than 30% of their income for. And to do that, we need a large amount of housing that is affordable to households making lower than 100% of area median income, to account for the fact that we don't have as much affordable housing right now on the ground. So what that means is a fundamental change in the way a lot of communities will need to plan for housing. Again, not build the housing, because they don't build it, but plan for it and accommodate it in their comprehensive plans and development regulations. So with that, the Department of Commerce projected future housing needs, and we projected future housing needs at a county-wide level because we recognize that counties always had the ability to determine how much growth they think they will see over the next 20 years. So the Office of Financial Management provides a range of population that they think each county will grow from low to high. And they say over the next 20 years, this is what we think, but counties, you get to choose how much you think you will grow. So we projected future housing needs at the countywide level, understanding that counties will need to make that decision, and counties also know best where to plan for their growth because they know generally where market conditions are, where there's available land, where there's infrastructure, what the constraints are. So we projected future housing needs at the countywide level, and counties will then decide how to divide up those housing needs across all income levels to each individual jurisdiction. So counties, again, may choose how much they grow, how much growth goes to each jurisdiction, and the way that they allocate them. But based on what we saw from the direction from the legislature, they don't get to choose the actual projection of housing needs at each income level. Those come from our Housing for All planning tool. As you see on this next slide, this is an example of what that looks like. So in our Housing for All planning tool, counties decide how much they will grow from that low to high range you see there in the maroon. And then based on the number that is entered into the tool, they use Commerce projections, which use locally available information and a statewide methodology that ensures that we're consistently planning for the same types of things moving forward and accounting for the same types of measures, what those housing needs are. And based on a medium population projection for Mason County, you'll see that the net new housing needs are highlighted in gray at the bottom. So that's the number of new housing units between 2020 and 2045 that the county would need to plan for if they chose the median population projection. And then you can subtract the number of new housing units that have been built between 2020 and the beginning of your comprehensive plan. So 2025 or best available information. So then the county then works together to decide where that growth will go. Where is it more important for more affordable housing to be located? How are we planning? What types of housing will be able to support those households making those incomes? And how can we encourage that type of housing in our community? Generally speaking, housing that supports households making over 120% of area median income can be larger and have more land. We equate that with single family homes, although middle housing and apartments can also be luxury and high-end housing and can serve households making greater than 120% of area median income. But generally speaking, as you think about planning for the types of housing needs that are identified in this process, this is a helpful graphic to kind of keep in the back of your mind. We do recommend that jurisdictions consider the types of housing that are affordable in your specific community, and this may not match your specific community exactly, but what is important to do is plan for the types of housing that is affordable at different income levels in your community, and recognizing that housing below 80% of area median income or specifically below 50% of area median income typically requires subsidies to be built or to be operated. So households, housing types that would get subsidies are the types of housing types that would meet these households' needs that are below 50% of area median income. And generally speaking, local, federal, and state funding for affordable housing, generally speaking, comes in the form of multifamily housing. There are some types of affordable housing that are subsidized in other types of forms and therefore can meet that housing need. But generally speaking, a lot of it is going to be in smaller units where there are more units on a lot, because then the costs are brought down, and that's the type of funding that makes sense for the state and the federal government to invest in, because they can support more households that way. So as we think about planning for the housing needs, we just recommend that you keep this in mind. So after the projected housing needs are identified within your community, again, you get to choose how much you will grow and how you will distribute that growth. You then get to the county and city in this case, and not cities, and as in many other counties, you get to decide where does it make sense for that growth to go, and how would you like to distribute that? There are three frameworks that we have provided as ways to consider as you divide up future housing needs. I won't go into all of the details here at this time, but I'm happy to do so if you have specific questions. But a jurisdiction, counties can decide however they want to divide up the housing needs. Some counties have used our Model A, some counties have used our Model C. Some counties have decided their own specific method based on their own local information and knowledge and constraints. But there are some minimum requirements, and those minimum requirements are just to make sure that we're following the state requirements. And that is you must make sure all of the housing needs add up to the minimum that comes from the HAP tool. You need to make sure they're consistent with your countywide planning policies, because that's another rule in the GMA, and that they need to be documented in each jurisdiction's comprehensive plan and in a outward facing document. Other than that, there are no specific requirements for how jurisdictions plan for their housing needs. Again, this is to make sure that we have the types of housing that residents in our communities need over the next 20 years so that they're not priced out, and that we can have the teachers and the firefighters and even the clerks for our grocery store who might only make minimum wage. We want the people to be able to live in our community so that they can support our communities and that we can be strong. When jurisdictions make these decisions, we recommend that jurisdictions consider how much land is available in each area, whether that's in the city, the county, in each individual urban growth area. We recommend considering what types of housing that land availability will serve, thinking back to that graphic that I showed you before with the types of housing and what is more affordable in Mason County. Where we can meet the housing needs at the lowest cost. We have a lot of housing that needs to be built, so we want to think efficiently. And also thinking about where more affordable housing should be located regionally. Do you want it located near infrastructure, transit, and jobs? And social services is probably where you want to support them, near our schools and universities. However, deeply affordable housing is not very appropriate outside of urban growth areas and local areas of more intense rural development, because at the scale and the type of funding that is needed to achieve affordability, that's just generally not possible under the under the Growth Management Act. So as you make these decisions, the minimum requirements are to include a table of the allocations between the city and the county, and that the total housing needs from all jurisdictions and add up to the total. Other than that, the flexible, but we do recommend developing policies that will guide those decisions so that you have a framework to build off of when you're making those decisions. Once jurisdictions have identified the amount of housing that they need to identify sufficient land capacity for all of the different income levels. Generally, this means presenting a table of the allocation, so the amount of housing that each jurisdiction was assigned. It's even better if you document the amount of housing that each urban growth area is assigned. That supports better planning as you go through this process. We recommend then relating each housing type to the types of how income levels that can reasonably be accommodated with that type of housing, and then showing there's enough capacity of that type of housing to meet that housing need. We have step-by-step recommendations for walking through that process in what we call our Housing Element Book 2, because there's a lot of guidance to develop this and implement the housing element updates. But in the short of it, if there isn't sufficient capacity for any type of housing need or any income level housing need, the jurisdiction must then identify and implement zoning changes to provide enough capacity by the end of the periodic update deadline. So if there's a deficiency, there'll need to be zoning changes to accommodate it. Generally speaking, what we have found from jurisdictions who have gone through this work and what we envisioned as being the impact of this new requirement to consider housing for all households, no matter their income, is that jurisdictions might find that they don't have enough land capacity for some of their lower income housing needs, and therefore they might need to allow a wider variety of housing types and or more mid or moderate density housing types in their communities, which are either generally more affordable just based on market conditions and or are affordable because they're subsidized by the state or the federal government. Understanding again that we will need lots of subsidies in order to meet the housing needs that are identified in these projections, but we have to have a goal and understanding of what we need so that we can plan for it moving forward. Also, with that capacity is that jurisdictions will need to plan for the infrastructure that will support that housing. So that we'll need the roads, the sewer, the water, stormwater to support those facilities, as well as the utilities and other capital facilities. And that jurisdictions may need to update the regulations to allow emergency housing and shelters and permanent supportive housing to accommodate those housing needs that come out of the projections of housing need. In addition to making sufficient any zoning changes that are needed, zoning is not the only thing that will encourage more housing in our communities and the type of housing that we need. There's lots of things come into play when we talk about what types of housing can be built in our communities. Generally, zoning is the big one, but also how much parking is allowed, what are the setbacks, how tall can you build, how much on a property can you build, what are the fees for building a certain type of project to connect to infrastructure. There's a lot of things that go into making sure housing can be built in our communities. And this section of the housing element requirement says, in addition to looking at what those what is needed to build just from an allowance perspective, what are those other types of things that impact housing in our community? What are those barriers that may be preventing the type of housing? And what can you do to remove those barriers moving forward? So to meet this specific requirement, the minimum requirements are to identify where housing production is not meeting local needs, identifying what factors are within the control of the local government that could influence and support more housing being built, the type of housing that is not being built, and what are the local actions or incentives that can be done to remove the barriers or incentivize the housing. Again, we recognize lots of funding will be needed to build this type of housing, but there's still opportunities for local governments to influence and to impact and encourage the type of housing that we need. So this is an example from Kitsap County's adequate provisions. We've developed a checklist which jurisdictions may walk through to identify what may be barriers to housing development in their jurisdiction. In this case, Kitsap County identified that high minimum lot sizes and lower densities or FARs, floor area ratios, could be contributing to the lack of housing that they need to meet the housing of all of the residents. And so they identified specific changes that they were planning to make in their codes to remove those barriers or to reduce those barriers so that to allow more housing to be built and encourage it to be built. So this is a good example of what that could look like in practice. The actions that jurisdictions identify and the legislature asks jurisdictions to identify don't need to be made with the periodic update, but the legislation does direct communities to develop a list of actions that they will take to remove barriers to housing. And finally, the last big component of a housing element update is new. As I mentioned before, the state recognizes that local governments in some way, shape, or form have potentially contributed to disparate impacts in housing in their community amongst all races and ethnicities. And the goal is to allow for everybody in Washington, regardless of how much you earn or what your race is or what you believe, to be able to access housing and to afford housing. We recognize that housing is important for us to be able to function in life, and local governments, in addition to this federal government and funding practices, have led to disparate impacts and excluding certain people from communities in our and communities throughout Washington. So the requirements are to identify if there are disparate impacts, exclusion, or displacement in each jurisdiction compared to either the neighboring jurisdictions, generally speaking, compared to the neighboring jurisdictions or Washington as a whole. And if there are, and regardless of if there are, evaluate what the jurisdiction's policies and regulations may have been that led to those disparate impacts or exclusion. In almost every community in Washington, there are disparate impacts, unfortunately, and honesty, not only because of land use, but because of a variety of different things. But land use has been directed as one of those things that we can contribute to at a local government level and a state level to help to undo those disparate impacts. So how have policies led to those disparate impacts, and how can they be revised? So one of the requirements is to evaluate policies and to strengthen them to remove anything that may have led to disparate impacts or exclusion or displacement in your community. And to do that, in a nutshell, we recommend that jurisdictions have policies to encourage more affordable housing, a wide variety of housing types, preserve housing, existing affordable housing, because we don't want to lose that. That's really important to make sure we're meeting our housing needs, and protect existing households from displacement when they may be at risk of displacement. We don't want people to be forced out of their homes. And the final requirement is that jurisdictions document areas at risk of displacement. We have a number of resources to help with this. And sorry for the last point. The reason for that is because as jurisdictions make zoning and investment decisions, those could lead to further displacement. And because the jurisdiction has a role in zoning and in providing and or planning for infrastructure, it's important to consider those displacement risks when those decisions are made. So we have some statewide available data for each jurisdiction. The county data is not maybe quite as good as the city level data, but happy to support you if you need any additional data. On that front, we have examples of policy review, and we have a displacement risk map. So we have some information to get communities started, and a wide variety of policies and regulations that jurisdictions can consider as they do this work to tailor it to their own local communities, because we recognize every community is different and every community needs to develop policies and regulations that fit their own environment, and they can do so under this framework. So one of the key pieces here is examining existing policies and seeing if they are accommodating all of the housing needs and or potentially contributing to burdens of some individuals more than others, and or increasing displacement risk. And then how could those policies be revised to remove that? And then how could the jurisdiction then work to implement those policies through programs and specific regulations to encourage and housing for all? And we recommend that jurisdictions consider evaluating their policies not only in their housing element, but consider other linkages to other policies and other elements as well. So here's an example of Steelacombe's policy evaluation. They evaluated the policies that you see here on their left, whether that was potentially challenging creating more disparate impacts, or if it was better aligning with the goal of removing those disparate impacts or exclusion in their communities, and what they might do about it, in the why. So in summarizing, a comprehensive plan under the new framework directed by the state is intended to encourage communities to plan for their housing needs of all income levels, of all races, and do so in a way that encourages housing for everybody that they can afford and moving forward so that everybody can achieve their own personal goals. And what that looks like is an allocation of housing needs from the countywide numbers that come from Commerce, understanding that local communities get to decide how much they will grow. Zoning to accommodate those housing affordability needs and the infrastructure to support them. Policies to encourage moderate density housing in urban growth areas. That was a new requirement that I didn't touch on before, but it is a new requirement in this realm, which achieves and helps local communities implement a lot of the goals that we've talked about. Identifying those barriers to achieving those affordable housing needs and actions to remove them. Developing policies and programs to implement a wider variety of housing types to remove those racially disparate impacts and exclusionary zoning in their communities. Finally, we have a checklist that helps walk communities through each of these requirements and shows what that new requirement is, or what the requirement is in the code, if that has changed since the last periodic update, and what Commerce will be looking for as it provides technical assistance to jurisdictions to review those minimum requirements, so that we have housing for all everyone in our communities. And that's available on our GMA updating GMA housing element webpage. Lastly, I just want to quickly mention that in addition to comprehensive plan, jurisdictions will also need to update their development regulations to be consistent with state regulations that have passed. As you are well aware, the state has made many changes to the requirements that local governments need to allow do to encourage more housing in their community. The items on the left are due with the periodic update. Jurisdictions must allow permanent supportive housing, transitional housing, emergency housing, and shelters in specific areas. They must allow bonus density on land owned by religious organizations, and adjust parking requirements based on specific requirements near transit, and just generally for parking requirements. On the right-hand side are requirements that are due 6 months after the update, including allowing 2 accessory dwelling units within urban growth areas, co-living, where 6 units per lot are allowed, unit lot subdivisions, which allow a property owner to divide up their lot and allow more individual home ownership opportunities on an individual lot. So hopefully increasing of housing affordability options there. They must develop proportional impact fees and the other items listed here. And we have lots of resources on our website. So if you have questions or want to dive deeper into any of these things, we have a guidance document, a recording, and a PowerPoint on that will talk about any one of these things, as well as a bunch of resources for the racially disparate impacts work and examples of work of communities that have already completed this work to date. And with that, I wanted to thank you very much. Hopefully I didn't go over my 30 minutes, and I'm happy to answer any questions you have.
Great, thank you, Laura. No, you're right at 30 minutes. So with that, what I'd like to do is, for the Planning Advisory Commission, we'll just start with whoever has the first question, work our way around the room, and we'll try and get around the 7 of us a couple of times in the next 30 minutes. So who wants to start?
Yeah.
And I've asked everyone to just try and keep your questions short and to the point.
Okay, mine short and sweet. On the page that has the breakout of the housing, page 7. How did we arrive, or how do we think we arrived at the numbers of housing that they're, basically somewhat subsidized up to like 50, not when I say subsidized, I don't mean up to 50%, but we're up to people making less than 50% of the median income. We came up with a total of 3,607 structures or homes. And I just want to know how we came to that figure roughly, if that can be said.
We have a lot of more detailed guidance, but in a nutshell, we projected how many new units of housing we need in the future based on the number of people that are going to be in the homes in the future, a 6% vacancy rate, and that ensures that there's enough homes on the market for people to move around. As we know, in the past few years, there hasn't always been a 6% vacancy rate, and it drove up prices and prevented people from moving around. And we removed second homes from the equation because second homes aren't permanent housing for people, and that means that they're not really a house that people are going to be living in long term. So based on that information, we projected how many housing units were needed in each county. And then we divided those housing units up by income level. And what we did, generally speaking, is it was a kind of a three-part approach. And we have details in our HAP tool that show you the specific numbers for each county. But generally speaking, we made sure there was a home for each person who was projected to be homeless in the future or without a home in the future. And that could be somebody who's currently doubled up right now or living with their parent when they probably should be out on their own, or somebody who is currently homeless. So we made sure there was a home for everybody there. And those households were typically in the income range of 0 to 30% of area median income. Then we said, all of those households that are currently renting right now, we want to eliminate cost burdening. So we recognize that if individuals are paying more than 30% of their income, they're sometimes having trouble choosing between medical care and their food or their child care or their transportation. And they're at risk of homelessness and needing more social services. So let's make sure that everybody there who's renting is not paying more than 30% of their income. We adjusted to remove that burden. And then the remainder of the households is divided up by the current breakdown of every household, of the current income breakdown of households in the county. And based on that, we arrived at the picture of that's the number of households that are needed at each individual income level for each county. And again, the data that breaks that down is in the HAP tool. If you go to the last tab in the HAP tool, you can go and look at what those numbers are specifically, and they're all based on county-specific data.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
I have a question on the same page. Your metric is labeled affordability level, but it looks like it's just percentage of the median income. Like suppose I'm at 60% under this metric of the median income. That doesn't mean I can't necessarily afford a place. Maybe I can't afford the median house, but there are places that I can afford. I mean, in the HAP tool, is there data that says this is the price of a house based on that particular percentage of median income?
So our HAP tool currently breaks down, apologies if this isn't quite answering your questions. I'm going to try to, and then tell me if I didn't answer it. In our HAP tool, we took the best available information that says, based on the number of households and the cost of each of those households and the typical household size, in addition to projecting how many housing units we need at each income level, this is the number of housing units that are in each income level now. So in the top row of the HAP tool on that one slide where you saw the county numbers, that's the number of housing units that are approximately based on the household income and the cost of the house, where they fall. Moving forward, we couldn't do that for every individual home, so we took an average. There's an average. So generally speaking, based on the average median income, that is a household could afford that much. And then when you plan locally, your local planners are have the ability to then look at what does that look like in your community. If a person making 60% of the area median income, can they afford a single family home? Can they afford a townhouse? Can they afford a manufactured home? Can they afford an accessory dwelling unit? And based on that information, they can plan accordingly with their comprehensive plan to consider what types of is there enough capacity in a jurisdiction, or do zoning changes need to be made? So there's a framework that then gets to be applied locally. But again, apologies, I'm not sure I totally answered the question. Could you restate it if I did not answer it?
Well, kind of related question.
Well,
You got,
if I can, I'm gonna move on to
Sure.
something else, make sure everyone has a chance here.
Okay, Laura, on your last page of the presentation on the left, and I'm kind of gonna butcher this, but the commerce is talking about increasing the number of people in the household, allowing an increase the household number.
So local governments may not regulate the number of people in a household. They can do so based on public health and safety. So based on occupancy per square foot or what the building code says, but they can't put an arbitrary number on the number of people living in a household. That is what the law says.
Thank you, because my question, more or less was, oh, if we allow more people to live in a house, what happens to our septic system?
Yeah, no, actually, that's actually one of the biggest, that and the building code are probably the biggest factors which determine and should determine and can determine the number of occupants in a household.
Okay, thank you.
Brad, do you have a question? You're on mute, Brad.
Okay, I did a question. I wasn't sure what the HAP tool was. Is the HAP tool an interactive website that we can periodically go to punch in numbers to allocate things? I mean, my second question then would be,
One question. Let's try and stick to one and get around the room.
okay, then let me forget that question. If I only have one question, then I guess I would like to know, on page 18, could you elaborate on examples of exclusionary zoning? Because I think that would be an area that we could use to fulfill the requirements. And but I can't think of what exclusionary zoning is.
Yeah. So, because I have the opportunity, I'm going to go ahead and answer both questions. The HAP tool is an Excel tool that is dynamic. It allows you to plug in your population number and then shows you their housing needs. And then is also dynamic in that it helps you distribute the housing needs if you choose to use one of the frameworks that are available, as well as a data tool that tells you the data behind how we derived our numbers. So it has three purposes. It's an Excel file on our website. Exclusionary zoning typically means, in this context, in the planning context, either a zoning regulation that precludes housing that housing different than a singular type of housing that is often very expensive. So very large lot zoning with potentially high parking requirements or large setback requirements could be considered exclusionary. And the intent is to encourage a wider variety of housing types that everybody can afford. In the sense that the state is directing communities to remove exclusionary zoning, understanding that outside of urban growth areas, there are requirements for minimum lot sizes. And so the intent is to address exclusionary zoning in urban growth areas.
Thank you.
Right. Mine has to do with infrastructure. But we mention infrastructure from time to time, but we talk a lot about how many houses we need. But obviously the infrastructure has to be built first. has there been any thought or study put into how that gets done and how it gets paid for, how it gets incentivized for developers to come in and do it? I just don't hear a lot of discussion in this whole process about how we get infrastructure built.
That is one area where I think that more guidance is needed. It is one I'm not an expert on, but I understand is critical. What I think is important to do is to work with either your engineering departments or your public your public service districts that supply the infrastructure and work with them to understand what are the how can they accommodate these growth patterns that are needed to meet our housing needs, what is needed to get there, and coordinate and work hand in hand with them, and recognizing that probably some additional guidance is needed because this is a very special area. It is one that kind of verges outside of typical urban planning, so it's something where I think uh, it is often lacking in communities because it's more complex and because it falls a little bit outside of the realm of where local governments function, because sometimes special purpose districts function there, and therefore Commerce has been directed this year to do some work and study to how to support communities planning for infrastructure, because oftentimes infrastructure is provided by special purpose districts and they're not held to the same requirements, or they are kind of a tangential group that supports local government. So ongoing work there, but working with your special purpose districts and departments that provide the infrastructure, because they are the experts in doing that and they do that on a day-to-day basis. Does that answer your question, or is there more that you were looking for? I see your face like.
I find it troubling that it's not part of the program. You mentioned it was another part.
Well, it's part of the program, but it's something that the planning department doesn't often do. So they have to work with other departments often to make sure that there's sufficient infrastructure. So it requires more people to be involved to implement. And that is where I think some of the breakdown happens, and where it's important to do a lot of the coordination, because otherwise you can't properly plan for it. And that's one of the reasons why I pointed it out. It's something that planning departments develop the land use the policies, the land use regulations, the permitting processes, but they're not the ones who operate the infrastructure on a day-to-day basis, or make sure that the pump station down the road is working, or that we're planning for this, the funds needed for the impact fees to pay for a new pump station down the road, or to upsize a sewer system. That's often done by another department. Therefore, there's importance in coordinating when you're planning for future growth with those either agencies, departments, or service special purpose districts to make sure that everything is being planned for to support that growth.
That's what we talked about too, is tying it out like with utilities and the transportation side, but it assumes where it's going. So there's some big assumptions. Joel? You got anything?
I'm just kind of, I don't know.
Joel now has 8 days on the PAC. Okay, so
Oh,
yeah,
he's gonna be the expert.
he's feeling something.
Expert of nothing.
Yeah, he's feeling something.
So I know that it's like we have a certain point to thing, and now for the state, is that for they take our county in consideration for the number that we're supposed to have, or is it like a state level type thing? Because I mean, Mason County, like you say, we have to have so many low income housing to whatever. But I mean, Mason County, I mean, our forest, our water, our things is what brings people in. And if we keep building into that, I mean, where do you draw the line per se to where you start taking away what's beautiful of Mason County?
Yeah, and that's where the local decision comes in, where you decide how much, the county decides how much they're going to grow. That's based on how much growth you're going to plan for. Will kind of not necessarily usher in how much growth, but that's where I think that decision comes into play. And how you work with and coordinate regionally, in county to county between different places. So the main thing is the population projection. I think that's where that comes in.
I'm gonna jump in. We've heard, we've had multiple groups and representatives, civilian, citizens are presenting here, talking about affordable housing. A key piece has been publicly funded, operated, and maintained. And when I look at the numbers on slide 5 and 7, 47% of all homes in Washington State are for folks below 50%, 45% in this county. Frankly, the costs scare me. Okay, if I just assume 1,000 square foot home at 250 square foot, we need $45 million a year in Mason County, and our general fund is about 52 this year. Numbers may be slightly off. In essence, what I'm hearing is unless the state is going to fund this or the feds are going to fund this, again, taxpayer dollars, we basically need to double our income. And that scares me. So as we talk about what the county can do, what can the state do to lower the cost of homes? That is my core question, because there's a lot that's come out of Olympia in the last 2-3 seconds that have added $50,000 to $100,000 a home. And we push that to the right.
Yeah. Thank you. We recognize that. The numbers scare us too. We've been working very closely with our housing division, and Ted Kelleher, the head of the housing policy lead for our agency, has costed it out. And it is like we need, I think it might have been like 12 billion or $12 trillion a year of state funding to do this. So we put in an enormous ask to the legislature for funding this year. We probably won't get it, but we recognize that there's a lot that needs to be done. And we recognize that the state needs to do their part. And the governor actually recently passed an executive order that said, what are the things within the state's control that we can do to address affordable housing? So I put that out to you guys. If you have ideas that the state can do, if you want to shoot me an email, let me know. We are supposed to relay those. I've heard a lot at meetings that the energy requirements added minimum $30,000 per unit to housing. That's one I forgot to put on the list that I sent to my boss the other day, but I will add that one. If there's other things, we're open to considering things. I mean, the legislature has to pass things, but we do want to hear your ideas and we will relay them. And I think everything's on the table at the moment.
Well, Laura, thank you for the opportunity, and I will follow up with an email. With that, we've gone around the table once. We still have about 11 minutes. So I'm going to try and go around the table again. I see Brad's hand up, so we'll start with Brad.
To that last question, how about utilizing tiny home neighborhoods? And I guess tiny homes could be less than, I wrote down 400 square feet, but you might be able to have 250 square foot tiny homes.
Yes, I love that idea. That is actually one I sent on today. Tiny homes are currently allowed in manufactured home parks. And I think there's lots of opportunity for them to encourage, incentivize them, and allow them. The state is currently looking at several bills that would allow RVs and or ADUs as tiny homes or otherwise to be on properties. So I think that's currently potentially in the works, but great idea. I will add that to the list.
Thank you. Round table, anyone with a second question? Nope. Then I'll jump in with one.
Oh, I have a question.
Go ahead.
Oh, do you have a question?
No.
On page 10, the note said deeply affordable housing is not appropriate outside of urban growth areas and landmarks. Is it not appropriate because it's not felt that it just won't work mechanically, or is it not appropriate because the rules outside urban growth areas constrain what is allowed to be done?
I think I should change those words. It's not appropriate. It's just not feasible, I think, at the moment. Lot sizes are large. Every lot you can build a single family home and maybe an accessory dwelling unit, and they need their own septic and well. And then everybody also needs to have their own car to drive. And public funders typically don't fund single family homes or accessory dwelling units on lots that are that large. They typically opt to fund housing that is um, more efficient use of funds and where people who need those funds can better access jobs and services. So unfortunately, either it's very difficult, if not impossible, to build housing that affordable in most communities. That being said, if you can show it, if you can show that you can build a manufactured home on a 5 acre lot or an ADU on a 5 acre lot and it that happens at scale in your community, show us the math and you could probably justify that. But we haven't been able to see that, unfortunately. But we do recognize that affordable housing is important everywhere. It's just not feasible to do new affordable housing with current costs of building things.
But my question is, by feasible, it's not like, well, it's not feasible because of the rules that apply to areas outside the urban growth area, like the 5 acre minimum. That's why it's not feasible, not because you couldn't necessarily change the rules to make it feasible.
Anyone else with a question?
Probably not.
No,
That's fair. That's out
out
there.
on there. So slide 20, due 6 months after update, 2 ADUs in urban growth areas. What about HOAs? We have any number of homeowner associations out here, and I'll just pick on one. You may be familiar with Alderbrook.
No, but I'm familiar with the HOA issue. I live in one.
So if an HOA currently does not allow an ADU, can the state direct them to change and force them to take 2 ADUs?
The state cannot change current agreements, but contractual agreements. They have said that local governments should not approve new HOA agreements and regulations moving forward, but they can't go back and change past ones. That being said, if an HOA doesn't enforce their regulations, a jurisdiction can still allow 2 ADUs on a lot, but it can't make them allow it. So like in my community, that would never fly because we have a really strong HOA. I mean, we built a playhouse and my husband made sure that that was like to code. And it was a playhouse. So yeah, no HOA here, but no ADU here. But in other communities, they may not care. So it may still be allowed, but they're probably not going to see many ADUs in HOA areas, unfortunately.
Hoorah.
Well, I'm going to go ahead and go on.
Well, I'd like to finish my question.
Okay.
I'm not sure she was allowed to answer it. I just want to make sure outside the urban growth area, feasibility is restricted because of the rules outside the urban growth areas. Not because, not theoretically, if the rules were different, it would not be feasible. Is that a correct statement?
Right. And when we look at planning under a comprehensive plan, we need to plan under the framework that we currently are living under and what the current regulations are. So I couldn't build, I couldn't live in a RV on my property and that's affordable right now because RVs are really only allowed in manufactured home parks. So I couldn't assume that everybody has an RV on their property and therefore we've met our affordable housing needs because everybody has an RV because that's not currently allowed. So when we look at planning for housing, we need to look at what is allowed under the current framework and what is likely to happen under the market conditions now and in the near future. So that's the framework that we plan under in comprehensive plans.
Got it, thanks. I just wanted clarity on what feasibility meant. Thank you.
Yes. Thank you.
Slide 4, when it talks about planning for sufficient governmental services to support housing, transportation, capital facilities, utilities. The word governmental, does that imply the government's providing that? Sort of follow up to Mike's.
So there are certain services that local governments need to plan for in the capital facilities element. That includes fire, schools, police, and parks, I believe. So those capital facilities are what local governments plan for under capital facilities. And the government is required make sure that there's sufficient levels of service for those 4 things. And local governments can choose to do other things, but those are what is required.
Thank you. Yeah, that makes sense. And the others, we have a mixed bag of who provides what. Some
Yeah.
In some cases it's private, some cases it's government, it's a mixed bag. All right. Any other questions around?
It looks like Brad has a question. I just saw that.
Brad?
Yeah, I just typed it in the chat, but I looking on the resources page, page 21, it looked like those were all underlined, indicating that they were hyperlinks, and yet on the PDF file, the hyperlinks are broken. Can you provide?
Yes, I will make sure that I think would the best way to email Melissa or Kel, Marissa or Kel the PowerPoint and they can.
Correct. So if you send it to Marissa or Mariah, that would be the best. They will get it out to the.
Okay, I will do that. I thought I had done with the hyperlinks, but if not, I will make sure I do that right after we.
No, that all you need to do is instead of printing the
export.
PDF where it breaks the links, save as a PDF,
Okay.
and the links are not
I
broken.
Okay. I often export and it works, but I'll try save as too. Thank you.
Save as a PDF, they don't break.
Thank you. And Laura, with that, again, I want to thank you very much for your time. We're right at an hour, so we're trying to hold us to our time frame so we can get out of here, but also to let you free for the rest of your evening because we're eating into your day. So
well, thank you so
very
much.
And we'll probably be chit-chatting or talking.
Yeah, if you have any other questions, please feel free to follow up with me. My email is on the slides.
All right. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
If I may, I see, I think Kathleen, are you the next briefer there? I am, on our side, we're gonna take a 5-minute break if that's all right. And so if everyone, if you want to pause or leave it running, I don't care, but let's take 5 minutes. We'll be back in here at 13 or 12 after according to that clock. So if anyone needs a restroom, this is the time to do it. All right, well, everyone, thank you very much for coming back. We're gonna move on to, we have, again, Department of Commerce.
It is, because they said they.
Ladies and gentlemen,
Hey, guys.
let's write it on down. We have the Department of Commerce back and they're gonna talk to us about the climate planning, climate change requirements. And Kathleen Wineland, if I'm saying that correct, is presenting. So Kathleen, do you go by Kathleen, Kathy? What's your preference?
I do go by Kathleen. Yeah, Kathleen Winan, Senior Planner, Department of Commerce. Thanks for having me. Thanks for inviting me. Can you see my PowerPoint presentation?
Yeah.
All right, 2 thumbs up. That's a good way to be. All right. So tonight, as you mentioned, I'm going to talk to you a little bit about the climate planning requirements adopted by House Bill 1181. I'll also share the commerce guidance related to that bill, and then share some resources that we have provided for communities to comply with this new law. Okay, I think Laura did a good job covering what we do at Commerce. I will just say that, like Laura, I work in growth management services at Commerce, helping with planning, technical assistance, and grants. Laura works in the housing team. I work on the climate team. But you also have another planner that can assist you. Carol Holman is your general planning helper on staff assigned to you. Okay, diving right into House Bill 1181. This was enacted in 2023. It adds a new goal to the Growth Management Act. It is goal number 14 now. Excuse me. And the intent of this goal is to adapt and mitigate to climate change, reduce greenhouse gas emissions and per capita vehicle miles traveled, prepare for climate impact scenarios, foster resiliency to climate impacts and natural hazards, protect and enhance environmental, economic, and human health and safety, and advance environmental justice. The climate planning law has 2 main parts. Is planning for resilience This part of it is mandatory for all jurisdictions that are fully planning under the Growth Management Act. And then there's a second part that is planning for greenhouse gas emissions reduction. This is mandatory for only 11 counties and their cities with a population over 6,000. The list of those 11 counties is on the right here. You will notice that Mason County is not on that list. And so Mason County is only subject to the resilience requirements of this act. And so that is what I'm going to focus my presentation on tonight. Okay, you probably all know this, but just so we're on the same page, I thought I would mention that Mason County's growth management update, including the new climate element, is due December 31st of this year. Along with your other friends in the green here on the map. Okay, and let's just define what climate resilience is as defined by this bill and the revised Code of Washington. So climate resilience is the ongoing process of anticipating, preparing for, and adapting to changes in climate and minimizing negative impacts to our natural systems, infrastructure, and community. Okay, so for your climate element, you're going to be guided by two documents. There's the House Bill 1181 itself, which is codified into the revised Code of Washington. And then the bill itself mandated that Commerce would publish guidance for how to comply with this bill. And we did so in December of 2023. So when you submit your climate element, these are the two documents that will be reviewed against, and these are the two documents that should be guiding your planning efforts. Okay, diving into what those requirements are. So we have engagement requirements, and these engagement requirements apply to all planning that you're going to do under the Growth Management Act, not just climate planning. But I did want to bring them up because the House Bill 1181 did actually update these engagement requirements. So for a while now, you've always had to do notice, make sure that your citizens, your community knows that there is an opportunity to review and comment on your draft plans. You are required to encourage involvement in the planning process. This should be early in the process and be continuous throughout the process. But the new requirement is that you must specifically include participation of vulnerable populations and overburdened communities. So what is that, might you be asking? And I will tell you. And so vulnerable populations are populations that are more likely to be at a higher risk for poor health outcomes in response to environmental harms due to adverse socioeconomic factors, including unemployment, high housing costs or high transportation costs relative to income, or limited access to nutritious foods, or other sensitivity factors. Vulnerable populations include, but are not limited to, racial and ethnic minorities, low-income populations, and populations disproportionately impacted by environmental harms. So vulnerable populations are people. Overburdened communities are geographic areas where vulnerable populations face combined multiple environmental harm and health impacts. So one classic example of an overburdened community is like apartments that are next to a highway or freeway that has a lot of vehicle traffic and a lot of vehicle pollution. We know nationwide that kids that live next to highways have higher instances of asthma. So in this case, they'd be considered an overburdened community. They're already at higher risk of asthma. And then those risks are compounded by climate change, where you might have more wildfire events, so poor air quality, or more heat events, so high heat days that could compound these asthma impacts, for example. Okay, so that is that. So for engagement, Now required to include to encourage participation of vulnerable populations and overburdened communities. Populations being the people and overburdened communities being the geographic areas. Okay, moving on to the other resiliency requirements. These are the requirements for your actual resiliency climate element. You must address all climate exacerbated natural hazards. That's the requirement in the law. In our guidance, we recommend that you include at least one goal and support a policy for each hazard that is relevant to your jurisdiction. So one example of a hazard would be extreme heat. So you would include one goal and one relevant policy for extreme heat if you find that's something that impacts your community. Okay, the next requirement is that you identify, protect, and enhance natural areas. In this context, we're looking for natural areas that have a resiliency benefit. For example, we know wetlands can address flooding impacts by slowing down the impacts of flooding, slowing down floodwaters. So that'd be an example of one area that you would want to identify, protect, and enhance. We're also looking at areas that are vital habitat to species that might be impacted by climate change. This could be the actual habitat. This could be corridors between habitat. Those are the areas we're looking to identify, protect, and enhance. Okay. More requirements. So you're going to identify, protect, and enhance community resilience consistent with environmental justice, including social, economic, and built factors. So this is a pretty broad directive. Our guidance provides more detail on how you can do this, and I will actually provide a little more detail on the next slide about this. And then the other requirement is you must prioritize actions that benefit overburdened communities most impacted by climate change. So once you've identified your impacts, you've gone through the process, you've decided what you're going to do, but you have limited resources, you can't do everything. You're going to prioritize your actions, and you want to prioritize those that benefit the folks that are most impacted by these climate change impacts. And you need to show that you're doing that. So we have received some climate elements, and we have had to write comments to people that say, we're not seeing where you have prioritized overburdened communities. So make sure you're showing your work so we can check that box for you. Okay. So as part of our guidance, we've identified 11 areas of community assets, 11 sectors to help you identify your assets for protection. Thank you to the chair who asked me to include this slide. This slide is not in your packet because I put it together today per request. I won't go over every single sector, but I'll go over some examples in some sectors for you. So the first one is agriculture and food systems, and in your case, it might include aquaculture as well. Some examples of impacts you might see is change in yields, change in pests, food scarcity after a hazard event. So that's some examples. Going into building and energy, some impacts you may want to explore include increased demand for heating and cooling, more interruptions of power due to more frequent hazard events. The next area, some examples of cultural resources impacts you might see is impacts to historic sites. Is there a historic site that might be at risk of flooding that wasn't at risk of flooding before? Is there a culturally significant species that is more at risk due to climate change? For example, some communities have a whole festival around a plant or animal. There might be culturally significant species to indigenous folks. So those are the kind of risks you're looking at there. Again, these are just examples. Our guidance has many more examples for you to consider. Okay, economic development. Some examples could be decrease in the number of jobs in agriculture, forestry, or tourism, and related to that, decrease in wages and revenue brought into the county. Examples for health and well-being, rising temperatures are especially hard on the elderly, disabled, and pregnant folks. Also on children's recreation, I know my daughter's swim lessons and soccer practice has been canceled due to wildfire smoke in my area. Let's see, you might see an increase in ticks, mosquitoes, harmful algae blooms. Okay, then looking at transportation, some things you might consider, some roads may not be designed for the temperatures that we are seeing now, so their expected lifespan might be less than previously thought. There might be increased freeze and thaw cycles that affect the lifespan of roads and other transportation infrastructure. Multimodal is definitely impacted. If there's more extreme temperatures, a walkable trip might no longer be walkable. For some folks who are disabled or elderly, you might need more shade around your multimodal routes. You might need more bus shelters in your community. Okay, and moving on to examples for zoning. As Laura said, there are more and more people wanting to move to Washington, and some of this can be fueled by displacement from climate change in other communities. So thinking about that when you're doing your housing forecasts. For site use design requirements, you might now need landscaping buffers for wildfire impacts in rural areas. You might see more landslides, erosion, and flooding. So some sites that used to be buildable are no longer buildable. So again, these are just some examples in these 11 sectors. You will definitely find different examples for your community and also in the guidance. Okay, so this is our guidance for how you go about meeting these requirements. This is not the only way you can do it, but this is our recommended way to do it based on our guidance and based on national best practices, a pilot study, and involving experts from all around the state in publishing this guidance. So step one, you're going to explore the impacts. We recommend that every community uses the University of Washington Mapping Resilience online tool. And you can also look at many other documents to gather this information on what kind of hazards might be relevant to your community. But you're also going to have local expertise. You're going to talk to your utility providers, your service providers, your foresters, your farmers, people who are impacted by the climate and who have knowledge about what is going on in your community. Okay, step two, you're going to go ahead and audit your existing plans, your existing comprehensive plans, other plans that you may have that touch these sectors, and you're looking for gaps that are not addressed. And then step three, you're going to assess your vulnerability and risk. So you're going to look at the hazards that are predicted to take place in the county. You're going to look how frequent, how severe they're going to be. And then you're going to look at your assets and see how vulnerable are they to those hazards. Where are there some weak spots that you can shore up to make sure you're more prepared for these changes. Okay, so once you've identified those, you're going to identify how you're going to update your plan to address these vulnerabilities. So there's a couple ways to do this. We call them pathways, but you can look at your existing goals and policies and adapt them to address these vulnerabilities. You can, of course, develop new goals and policies, or the bill does provide for you to go ahead and adopt a FEMA hazard mitigation plan by reference. So a couple different ways. A lot of communities are doing all three. So whatever mix works for you to address the vulnerabilities that you have identified. Then you're going to go ahead and integrate those goals and policies into your comprehensive plan. Okay, a little bit more about FEMA hazard mitigation plans. The good news is if this is something you're interested in, there are lots of commonalities between FEMA guidance and Commerce guidance. Both require that you create an equitable planning and engagement process. Both require that you identify local assets and you assess how climate change exacerbates natural hazards and risks to those assets. You address hazards that affect jurisdiction via goals and prioritize actions, also called measures or policies, and that you plan for equitable outcomes, ensuring that communities that are most harmed by these hazards will benefit from the actions that are proposed to mitigate these hazards. Okay. But we will say, while there's a lot of commonalities between FEMA requirements and the requirements of this bill, oftentimes if you do plan to adopt a hazard mitigation plan by reference, you will need to supplement that with a few policies. Here are some areas that we know that FEMA hazard mitigation plans don't do a great job at covering. Cultural resources. Again, that's those historic sites, those species of significance. Winter recreation, this says winter recreation, but it could really cover all recreation, isn't very well addressed by a hazard mitigation plan. If recreation is important to your county and is vulnerable to these impacts, you'll probably want to make policies to address it, as well as active transportation. Okay, this brings us to the resources. We have developed, with the help of many experts across the state, as well as nationally, Climate Policy Explorer. So this is a database of sample policies that you could implement in your comprehensive plan. You could, of course, modify them to best meet the character of your community. We have them sorted by all kinds of things, and you can filter and search for them as you need. So you can filter by sector, you could filter by hazard. You can see this little orange high priority. Those are measures that have been found to be especially effective. And you can print out a fact sheet about a measure. All sorts of ways to explore these policies and see if it'll work for your community. So you don't have to start from scratch when thinking about how can I address these identified vulnerabilities. We also have several other resources, including, of course, a website. And as mentioned, we have the guidance document. We are currently working to, it's called rulemaking. It is to update the Washington Administrative Code. So in Washington, you have the Revised Code of Washington, which is the law, and the Washington Administrative Code is written by the state agencies to help people and determine how to comply with the law. So that update for House Bill 1181 will be completed at the end of the year, and concurrent to that, we will be updating our planning guidance. But as you are planning right now, again, your two main guiding documents will be the law and the current intermediate guidance. Excuse me. So one appendix to the planning guidance is the climate element workbook. This is an Excel file that you can fill in the blanks for your community that helps you through that process that I shared earlier. It's a good resource. Mentioned the mapping tool. There are also other mapping tools that can help you identify vulnerable and overburdened communities. These are available through the state health department. There's also a national tool for planning, for resilience planning, that is available. And then we have a guide that shows the difference between FEMA and Commerce guidance, so you can review if you're looking at that option. In addition to technical assistance, the legislature has also provided financial assistance for this planning requirement. They have allocated Climate Commitment Act funds. Mason County is currently under contract for $125,000 for a planning grant and is eligible for up to another $175,000. This map is showing all the communities that are currently participating in this grant program. The counties are shaded and the cities are the little dots. Okay, that is what I have to share with you. Of course, I'd love to answer any questions. This is created by a whole team of folks. I will do my best to answer your questions, but if I don't have the answer, I can get it for you.
Well, Kathleen, first, thank you very much. It's now 7:30. I'm sure you have something better to do, but you're spending time with us, so thank you very much for doing that. With that, we have 6 members of the Planning Advisory Commission in front of you here in this room. We have 1 online. That's the entire commission. So does anyone have a question to start with on the PAC? All right, Jeff.
No, I don't have a question. I just got, the other day or yesterday, downloaded the planning tool, the 150-page planning tool. So I'm just now into some of that, and the overburden issue was explained here. So I don't have that as a question. And the only thing else I'd point out is that the RCW reference there, actually, if you read the full RCW, section 16 of the RCW, and even better, believe it or not, explains the issue of, what is climate defined as.
So Kathleen, I'll toss a question out. Who is fiscally responsible for paying the implementation? And for example, on slide, I think it's 17, there's 2 high priority, very effective measures. One is ensure buildings are renewable energy, conservation, efficient. Basically, they're lead buildings, the way I would term it. The other is a net zero greenhouse gas emission feature. I'm sure both are very effective, but we have buildings that are 40, 50, 100 years old. Retrofitting them would be very expensive. So some of these may be more effective, come with a price tag. Who is responsible for coming up with those funds, the county or the state?
Yeah, so it depends on the strategy. The building requirements that you mentioned and new construction, that would be a standard that you would set, and it would be the responsibility of the developer, of course. As far as retrofitting buildings, I know there's definitely grants available for those kinds of things. I'm not an expert on that for sure, but I know in my community, like the power company provides grants for retrofitting buildings to be more efficient. Let's see, what was the other? Was the net greenhouse gas reduction. So again, Mason County not required to implement greenhouse gas reduction. But that would be implemented through kind of a suite of policies, and they would have varying funders from the local government, from, different strategies, like, for example, increasing transit would help reduce greenhouse gases. That would be the responsibility of the transit agency, probably funded by federal grants. So different strategies have different funding strategies as well. I know we are always advocating for more state funding for implementation of these strategies. Not always included in those budgets, but we certainly try.
A question is regarding this mapping tool you mentioned. It made me think of this in our last meeting a couple weeks ago. We had a pretty good discussion about critical areas like aquaculture areas along shorelines of wetlands and things like that, critical habitat, we could call it. And my question was at that meeting is there a mapping, a map of some sort that is available to help guide the staff and planning department and so forth when it comes to permitting developments, for, housing and so on that may start to impact these critical areas, especially, as the need for housing is ever increasing and density, eventually starts to encroach into these vital areas. I have a mapping tool, but it just made me think of that, if you guys are, if there's something like that available to help the staff plan for that.
Yeah, that's a great question. The answer is there's multiple different maps that you would probably want to reference for that. I'm not familiar with the county's current critical area ordinance, but that's a good place to start. Looking at wetlands, geological hazard sites. If you don't already have those maps, I'm sure we can look at hooking you up with some mapping resources if they are available. In some cases, if they really aren't just mapped, a good implementation project would be to hire a professional like a wetland biologist, geologist to map these areas. But in the case of flooding, of course, there's FEMA flood maps. There's topo maps can often identify these areas. Washington definitely has geologically hazardous areas mapped. So there are a lot of different resources to help us identify these areas. I could definitely follow up with some links to resources that I know are available if that would be helpful.
Yeah.
Okay.
Brad? Oh, Brad's hands up. Go, Brad.
I typed it into the chat, so that could be part of the minutes. Again, like I asked Laura for the hyperlinks that I believe are on slides 14, 18, and 19, if you could provide us with those hyperlinks. They're broken on the PDF files that were given.
Yes, I can absolutely provide those links. They are broken.
And also provide a hyperlink to the University of Washington online mapping tool.
Sure.
That brings up a question to staff. Is the consultant, I forget the three-letter acronym, CSJ, whatever, are they going to be writing these documents? So we'll just have to be assured they put this data in there. Question for staff.
They are following the requirements of the state, so they're very well aware of requirements that both Laura and
Okay.
provide.
I do have one other question. I don't want to.
Oh, go ahead, Brad.
On slide 11, the quote, built environmental factors. Like I asked for examples of the exclusionary zoning. Could you give some examples of quote unquote built environmental factors on slide 11?
Yeah. I'm just looking at slide 11. Yeah. So built environment generally refers to anything that is built by people. So that is buildings, that is roads, schools, sidewalks, anything built by people is considered the built environment. So when we're saying identify, protect, and enhance community resilience, including these factors, when we say the built environment, we just mean look at the impacts to your buildings, your roads, your infrastructure, your pipes, your sewer treatment plant, whatever it is that people built that the community relies on. You want to look at the climate impacts to those items.
Let me throw another one out here. If you could go to your slide 12, please, where you list the 11 sectors.
Yeah.
So when we plan and address these 11 sectors, so we look at the different hazards. So let's just, for the sake of discussion, say it's a change in temperature, it's a change in sea level, and it's a change in rain and when rain occurs, when precipitation occurs. Do we then need to have a per hazard, a response for each of those 11 areas? How does, I mean, I listened, I'm like, as I was listening, I'm going, there's a lot of potential detail here, particularly if we're defining geographic areas as like an apartment complex, you know. We got, you know, roughly 1,000 square miles, and, you know, we could, depending on how you look at it, different habitats, different plants, different animals, this could be a plan in and of itself.
Yeah, absolutely. And so working with your consultant, these are a list to review as far as detailing out which sectors that you're going to focus on. I really look at kind of this Venn diagram here of look at, you know, which assets are most vulnerable to the hazards that are predicted. And those are the ones you're going to focus on and detail out. You know, you're also going to think about the impact, the input from your community. What is your community most worried about? You know, which assets do your community value? Who's the most vulnerable? Those are the kinds of things that you're going to think about when you determine which of these sectors and which of the related impacts you're going to focus on in your plan.
Okay. Looking at the UW climate mapping tool, the recommendation is to use the planning period of which we are planning for. So in our case, it would be planning for approximately, you know, 2046, 2050. As we've listened to different members of our community here, and we've looked at you know, different sources, there are others that would argue that, or others would advocate, that's a better word, for a longer time period. Is Commerce supporting the UW climate mapping tool recommendation, or is Commerce looking for a longer period for planning?
Yeah, so the Growth Management Act requires that you plan for the next 20 years. But that being said, you know, some things you might want to plan out for longer, depending on the thing, you know, depending on the community asset, depending on the anticipated impacts. So I wouldn't limit yourself to 20 years, but the Growth Management Act requires that you plan for the next 20 years. I know when I've worked in municipal government, you know, most things we plan for the next 20 years. Our capital program, we plan for the next 5 years, but some things we did plan for the next 50 years, 100 years, whatever it is. Some things that were really valuable and spoke to the essence of our community, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, I'm just, from a personal perspective, I just want to be mindful of what the requirement is, what we do as a community. And then as we potentially, you know, consider more, we first make sure we have covered the minimums appropriately, because there was a lot in what you discussed tonight, and a lot what Laura discussed earlier in housing. It's comprehensive is a good word.
Yeah.
There's a lot there. Anyone else?
I'm good.
All right, go down my list one more time. So we've talked timeline. Oh, one other. So on slide maybe 10, under environmental justice, we talk about things to consider, including social factors. And one tool that we've been pointed to is the Washington Tracking Network, source on environmental public health. And when I look at some of the factors to consider, socioeconomic includes, you know, percentage of high school diploma, percentage of people with color, English other than as a primary language. And as I start to consider those as things under the broad term environmental justice and under the climate change, I'm struggling to understand how these connect. And I guess most importantly, twofold. High school graduation rates is a national concern. Not sure how we in Mason County are going to affect that under our climate change. Number two is some of these others, very frankly, I don't know what the standard is. We have a population makeup different than the rest of the state from a racial perspective. So are we supposed to change that? And I've asked the question, but I haven't gotten an answer. I'm not looking for one from you either. I'm just sort of, as we hear things, these are challenging.
Yeah, so the key to vulnerable populations is that these are people that are more at risk of poor health outcomes in response to environmental harms. The factors that you mentioned are indicators of who these people might be in different communities, not just in Mason County. So these indicators may or may not apply to your community specifically, but these have been identified as indicators that can help us identify who these people are who might have these poor health incomes. For example, you brought up high school graduation. If somebody does not have a high school diploma, they definitely will be more vulnerable to hazards of it, like, for example, a declining job market due to climate change. Maybe their industry is under threat. That makes it harder for them to go out and find another job if they don't have a high school diploma. So that factor might indicate that this person is a vulnerable person to climate change. So these, again, are just factors to help you identify these folks in your community. I think, unfortunately, you just, these maps are tools, but you got to go out and do the work. They kind of flag where these populations who might be, but using local knowledge, talking to your local experts, will also help you identify where your community's vulnerabilities are to climate change.
Okay. Thank you. Any other questions? Brad? Again,
No.
thank you very much. You've hit a record, 39 minutes instead of an hour.
Woo!
You're free. So, all right. Thank you very much for your time.
And thank you. Yeah, I will follow up with this link. Thanks so much for having me. And thank you for your work on this item.
Yeah, and just send everything to Marissa and Mariah. They will get it appropriately distributed to the PAC through the right means.
Great, will do. Thank you.
You, Kathleen. All right. So with that, guys, what I'd like to do is, while we're here and sort of thinking about this, I'd like to just go around the room and say, so, as we look at housing, and we'll go around once, and then we'll go around climate change. What, I guess, are your first impressions, thoughts, concerns, excitements, because you know something you don't, whatever. A couple of minutes per person, maybe, if it takes that long, we'll go from there. So hopefully that makes sense, and hopefully that will be useful. Who wants to start?
Oh, I'll start. I always come back to the infrastructure.
Yeah, let's start with the housing first, and we'll come
Yeah.
back. Yeah.
Yeah, the infrastructure. That's still, to me, that's the horse that leads the cart. And if we don't talk about that, how we're going to fund it, how we're going to build it out, the development can't happen. We're not going to have affordable housing. We're going to have a place for them to be built. So is there incentives to get this stuff put in? If we identify a parcel of land the developer wants to come in and develop, how is that infrastructure going to get paid for to incentivize that developer to come in and build that? Through bonds and then impact fees to pay the bonds back would be one way. I just don't know. I never find that in our discussions about this.
If I may, that's one thing that's totally new to us. There's been no discussion of potential fiscal impacts of any way, shape, or form. Yeah, and that, yes.
Let me answer that a little bit. Remember that Laura said this bill, the bill does not mean that jurisdictions need to build the housing. So that's not part of our job. The only thing we can do is say we have to not have any barriers to the zoning. But I mean, jurisdictions need not build the housing. So we're basically absolved from any responsibility. Not our job.
Captured your comment.
What's that?
I've captured your comment.
Yeah,
Who wants to go
hey,
next?
you don't want me to
Mr.
follow
Carey.
up on that one.
Yeah, no, we will.
Yeah, go for it.
Just
Yeah. So what I want, again, guys, what I want to capture are your thoughts on housing.
right.
And then we'll figure out how to fix things later, but, you know, we're kind of, yeah. I know. But I think it's important because I think we offer 7 different sets of ideas, and I'm confident as we get into the next meeting where we will have a housing element review, I'm confident we're gonna get a lot of feedback from the public too, which is good. It can feed into everything else we're doing. What's your summary? of
My
this?
summary?
Concerns or highlights or, yeah.
I'll go to summary.
Yeah.
What becomes, first of all, I appreciate, having this, and there was, a lot of times in these presentations, you don't learn a lot, but there was a number of things covered, a number of things referenced, and gave some background to it, so I appreciate that. In putting it together and kind of, it's a takeoff a little bit from the infrastructure, but what's pointing out to me is, we, and I say we, the PAC, 8 county people within the county, don't have a good grasp. We each have a little bit of understanding, but we can't, we don't really understand what the problem is here. And what I mean by that is, for example, we don't have an easy to understand inventory of what we have for capital facilities. And when I mean, as particular, take the sewer. You'll hear different things said by different people and in different environments. But we, and I speak the word we don't understand how much further can Shelton go with their infrastructure, with where it is without having to spend a lot of money. Forgetting what policy, which tack they take, then you take that to Allen. Same thing. Because I'm more familiar with Allen, and that's been a moving number over the last 20 years of what that could or could not do. And there's factors influencing that, from low flush toilets that came in, the last 10, 15 years versus what was, 20 years ago. But we don't have a good inventory understanding of our capital facility capacity to handle the population within just take our UGAs. And then, same with Belfair. Belfair can only treat so much right now. It has the capability of doing 4.25 million gallons a day of effluent, but there's things you gotta do to get to that point, other costs that are incurred and so these haven't been properly presented minimally in an Excel format where you can see, okay, if we allocate this much population, this is what it means in our water needs, this is what it means in our sewer needs, this is what it means in power needs, on and on and on and on. And all I'm saying is, we're allocating population, or looking at populations here for the next 20 years. And we'll say, we'll take Carol's word for it, that yes, there's land within these UGAs to handle the quantity of homes they're talking about. No rest of the glue that says, can we really do that with the, with the funding and the approach we have? As an example, Belfair has one type of approach to sewer development and extensions. Allen has another. Allen's is more burdensome for the developer, way more burdensome. You have to do it all. Belfair, not so much. In other words, you have to do the last little bit, but not the big chunks, whereas we have to do all. So anyway, I guess summing it up is, it's occurring to me that even in taking this data, forgetting whether I wanna argue with it, whether it's right or wrong, and how they might have come up with it. On the bigger picture, stepping back, we just don't understand what we have, and so how in the heck can we ever reasonably apply populations to these UGAs that we have the capacity even? So, I know that's a mouthful, but there you go.
I think there are some resources, for example, PUD has done their own projections and so forth, you know, based on their estimated future or whatever, but, yeah, I was wondering about these income, categories by percent of median income. And maybe I'll just send a question to Marissa to pass on, or Mariah. That's not a static number for the individual. Someone who might be in the 30 to 50, hopefully they'll rise over the next 20 years. There'll be new entrants that'll fill in the bottom. I wonder if they included all that in, you know, these projections here. And where I was going with the outside urban growth area, it seems like that's very restrictive, just because of the rules. So what's the idea? We've got these finite areas, the urban growth areas. So as things grow, we're just sort of pack them in further and further. Can the UGAs be expanded or added to? I don't know.
They can be.
I heard a story once, like for the Shelton UGA,
If we
they
can,
wanted,
just.
they wanted to, well, let me have my monologue too. Just not the only one that gets to have a monologue. Anyway,
Thanks, Saturday Night Live.
The Shelton UGA, there was a comment, they wanted to add somebody to the UGA, but they couldn't because there was a maximum tolerance, so they took someone else out. And I asked a question up in Alley the other day, didn't really get an answer, so. But the general question is, how do we accommodate everything being packed into these finite areas? I don't know, because we're restricted. And she was talking about housing. Yeah, like maybe instead a developer for these inexpensive houses like mobile homes, container homes, whatever, and sent them to make a village. Maybe it costs them $60,000 per unit. I don't know what the number is, but that would be roughly $350 to $400 a month. Financing and expenses, and send them to do that, and then they can charge a reasonable rent to lower income people. Well, my point is, can you do that sort of thing inside the UGAs? Maybe it could be appropriate outside the UGAs, but it ain't feasible because the rules prohibit it. Anyway, that's all I got.
I captured your comments. Go for it, Bob.
Well, I'm sitting here thinking about all this stuff that is required by the commerce guys, gals. And I'm wondering, how big an army is staff and the consultant to do what I can very easily see is gonna run us into several man years worth of effort. There's a lot of stuff that needs to be done, okay, that the commerce requires.
And our consultant has been working on it. So.
Yeah,
And feel free to jump in.
So this presentation is just a refresher of what the minimum requirements are. The consultant has been working on this for a while. They have been evaluating our current houses, let's say housing. They have been evaluating the current elements against what is mandated and revising the draft. And so what they're going to bring forth to you is the minimum requirements, and then you can decide if you want to do anything beyond that. They're also going to have recommendations for policies too. So you can decide, you know, what policies you want to include, you know. So they have been already working on this, so it's not like this, from this presentation, we're starting from the beginning.
my concern is, boils down to is our consultant gonna drop everything on us all at once? Cause this has gotta get done, you know, according to our timeline in May.
No, so like I discussed at our last meeting, so June, we will have a draft to Commerce for the purposes of the grant. We will be working on it beyond that, so if we have to go back to the housing element. So at this meeting on the 17th, you guys can't come to a consensus or there's like too many issues that you're still finding, we're gonna have additional meetings to discuss that further. So, and it's gonna probably go past June, most likely. So, I don't want you guys to worry about the schedule.
Brad, what's your summary on housing? Or what are your overarching concerns, aha moments?
I think we should really focus on these tiny homes, make tiny home communities that they can be built for $20,000.
Cool.
A lot to take in. I said I'm just
Yeah.
as 8 days in and trying to figure things out and stuff like that. I think for me it's just a more just breaking down and taking in these sites that they're giving us to know, to make myself knowledgeable of what we can do, what can be done, where we need to be.
You can always say fun.
No, that's.
I punt.
Yeah, my big concerns going forward are, our projection is 45% of all homes for the next 20 years are for low income. At this point, the only, we've talked tiny homes tonight, but prior to tonight, it's largely been publicly funded, operated, and maintained. And we're looking at, pick your numbers, 45, 50, $60 million a year simply to support Mason County. That's very concerning to me. We will have to find something else. Right now, it's unlikely Washington can cover the funds they need as a state. We're 12 to 13 billion underwater right now. There is under legislation, there is a number of bills with regards to affordable housing that does create a fiscal base for affordable housing. Some would authorize our commissioners, instead of providing 1%, allow them to go to a 3% increase per year. Our commissioners have traditionally not done that for some years. There is sales tax and other taxes, property taxes, 0.1% here, 0.2 there, across over a dozen bills. Sorry about that.
No problem.
To generate an affordable housing fund. Again, that's I think problematic. Those are big. The last thing is, do continue to think about overarching thoughts and ideas. There's a number of really high level things here that when we get that packet in May, the complete plan, we might need to put a cover letter to the commissioner saying, we've looked at this and here are some, really big considerations, before this thing gets approved that needs to be looked at. And I think we've covered, you hit a number. All right, so that's housing. I'd like to do the same on climate change if we can. Anyone have comments on climate change?
Well, I guess one oversight or big picture is supposedly there's a committee already working on this.
The CEQA.
Yeah. I'm anxious to see what that is. There are a lot of, when I say opportunity, that's code for a lot of problems. But there's a lot of opportunities in the, if you just take one issue, like landslides, unstable ground type issues. There's just a lot of things to address in this county on that whole area. And it does affect all economic groups. It affects transportation, it affects, health and welfare, various communities and neighborhoods and what have you. So I'm really fascinated to see what they come up with. Case in point, basically from the intersection of Highway 3 and 106, that whole hill all the way down 2.5 miles is basically a moving hill in the last 150 years. And yet, you got housing of all types.
There's always a landslide there
Right,
at
so,
some point.
and I was even surprised to see that when you look at it, step back, it kind of makes sense, but as far down as, which is about 2.2 miles, Cedar Street, it goes up like this and then flattens out. Well, that whole berm was a slide once upon a time. It came flushing out of it. And so I'm just curious, because that's a geological portion, there's other things like fire, there's, all it takes is one, I mean, we saw what happened with the fire over here by Rainbow Lake 2 years ago. We lucked out, when I say we lucked out, meaning we didn't have winds, we didn't have an onshore push like we get a lot of times in the summer. That would have taken, if you had that, that would have been a mess, a nightmare. So I guess what I'm saying is we're kind of early in the game. Obviously, you have a committee working on it. I'm kind of interested to see how they put that together. And like I said, I just now downloaded, like the plan checklist or whatever they call it, a guide. It's 150 pages of stuff. So anyway, I'll read more and learn more. So thank you.
Anyone else on climate? My concern on climate is the secure scope. About the time that Kathleen was saying a geographic area is an apartment complex, I was going, holy buckets, we could have a long list. And then you look at all the multiple, I mean, if you discuss carbon monoxide, from cars, but there are many other hazards that are out there and ways to look at it. I really looking forward to seeing what's provided from CPAC and looking forward to seeing, I guess, how it addresses a very wide element. And that's just not true nature piece. And environmental justice, and we started to talk about Kathleen talking very well how the lack of a high school can affect your income, can affect. So it now ties back to it's my example here isn't appropriate. I hopefully the idea is being communicated, even if I got a fact wrong somewhere in my example. And it concerns me because, some of these are social issues that we have been tackling from a number of perspectives in my lifetime, and we're still tackling it. And in some cases, they're worse than they were 60 years ago. So that is.
Sorry, the EPA was started way back when I was in school. I mean, that was like,
I'm sorry.
EPA.
Yeah.
I mean, they've been talking about this for decades, so like you said.
Yeah, no,
So
you and I aren't that far off. Yeah, no, and that's my concern is now we are being bound to a plan and we're being asked to do it. And I'm like, okay, and someone's gonna, and we heard Kathleen talk about, hey, we've checked some and these areas are weak, and it's like, this ought to be real interesting.
Well, so I'm wondering, like in our example of the apartment building by the road, how much control do we have over it as opposed to?
Well, it may already exist.
Yeah.
Okay, but the question is now what?
What are we doing to fix the problem? Or what are we?
Or address it.
Or can we address it? Do we have?
Well, you can mitigate, you can.
I mean, yeah, you want to talk about it, but.
No, but you can do things to mitigate, as an example, maybe like they were talking about the fact of trying to get more transit versus more highway.
Yeah, that's true.
So there are things, but
That's true.
it's a reach.
But in general, there are some things we have no control over, like in housing, we have no control over mortgage rates.
No, yep, you're right.
So,
Yeah, but it's, I just think, go back to the Venn diagram that you talked about. Step one is list the topics. And I didn't say issues, I just said topics. And I'm like, that could be an extensive list. I hope the CPAC team, they're going to be a very busy group.
whoever
I'll
they
be-
are.
yeah, I'll be interested to see what they come up with, so.
One other point, and I never got a chance to look at it, but you know, there's the whole emergency management report. It's it's 315 pages.
I haven't read it.
And I just looked and said, okay, that touches this area, but I have not had it. So
No,
I'm hoping that those all involved with it look at that.
there's a lot of reading involved.
Yes. Anyways, I'm just saying it's broad, supporting the point.
The good news is we have a year in, go as it goes.
What you don't know.
All right. Okay.
Sterling.
Any other comments on climate change? With that, I believe we have.
Hold on, Mr. Chairman.
Yep.
I had communicated with I'd like to propose that we request some information from the Washington Policy Center, and in particular, God, I forgot his name, Todd Myers, who's their vice president of research. He's written some good articles on climate change. I attempted to contact him to ask him, and he was very busy in the new legislature. But I would ask that we communicate with him and ask him to come and give us some information on that, and perhaps also another person from the Climate Heritage, the Heartland.org, a guy by the name of Sterling Burnett, who has series of video podcasts, and ask them for solutions that we might implement here. So if I'll get some contacts to staff, and if they can contact them, seeing if they can come and present to us as well to give us a better explanation. But Sterling Burnett from the Heartland organization, and Todd Myers here locally with Washington Policy Center. WashingtonPolicy.org is their website. I could send some. I do have their contacts. I can share a contact with staff, or you will, Mr. Chairman.
Like where I was, yeah. So, Brad, if you could send the information to Marissa or to Mariah, send it to staff. Don't send it to me, please. And Marissa's comment was very similar to what I was thinking in my head is from a time perspective, we meet again in 2 weeks. It's a workshop it's a regular meeting, and we are to look at the draft housing element and the revised economic development element. My gut call is that's going to be a long meeting. There's a lot in housing, as we know. And so we'll have to look and see how things fit in. And somewhere between that meeting and the April meeting, I believe we're to get the climate change, the draft. I think at one point it was homework coming out in March for us to prepare for April.
So I currently have the draft for April 21st, but that may be in progress
Yeah,
at that
it
time.
may be a 60% draft, not an 80% draft.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, hey, 60 is better than blank. Okay. Brad, if you could just send that to Marissa, so she has that in her records. And then, because next meeting, we also will likely take a relook at the bylaws. That was what was decided at the last regular meetings. We'll go from there. Anything else, Brad?
I will share a contact. So I don't have Marissa's cell phone. See if Marissa can send me a cell phone so I can send those contacts as a VCF file.
Please,
rather than email.
Please email her. Yeah, her phone is the office phone and you don't have a, he does not have a county cell phone. It's not appropriate for her to do county business on her personal phone. So
Nope, it's not.
anything else, Brad?
No.
Anything else around the table?
I just want to make a quick comment on Brad's last comment on the housing. I also like the tiny house idea or tiny houses, villages, however those are defined. Question is, where can you put them? So personally, I'd like to know more about the rules for UGAs, can they be expanded, that kind of thing. That's my comment, thanks.
Yeah, so, that should be in the housing element when we see that. And we should see it at that point, a summary of what can or can't be built, and we should have some ideas. So
That'd be good.
anything else around the table? I'll entertain a motion to adjourn.
So moved.
I'll make a motion to adjourn. Anyone second it?
Second move, all in favor? Thank you, folks. And everyone, thank you very much for your time this evening.